Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Max Rodenbeck, and I'm a journalist, which may seem a strange occupation to be reporting on something as ancient as Cleopatra. But actually, I lived in Egypt for some 30 years and have written quite a bit about the country, so I do have an Egyptian side. Cleopatra, what an extraordinary woman. I don't think in history there's ever been any woman who's been so considered who's so enigmatic, really, who's been so overwritten after her death, who's somehow she's tragic, she's sexy, she's the very last queen of an independent ancient Egypt. She was the lover of two great Roman leaders. She's also the murderer, perhaps, of her own two brothers. What a story. I mean, what fun to write about Cleopatra. I can hardly think of anything that would be more fun to write about, in fact. Lucy, but if you look at Lucy Hughes Hallett's list of books that she's written some extraordinary books, each one very, very different from the next. So you've moved on from Cleopatra to a book about something quite different. If Cleopatra is a heroine to some people, Lucy's written a book about heroes as well, men in history, which is fascinating. And one of the most interesting self-created heroes, also the Italian poet Gabriele d'Annunzio, and a new novel as well, which is set partly in the 17th century and partly in the 20th century. I mean, and your books look absolutely fascinating. So I'm really looking forward to plunging into the entire world of Lucy Hughes Hallett. So let me just, can we have a round of applause for Lucy? Now, Lucy, your book on, to be honest, your book on Cleopatra is more about, and perhaps this is fitting for an ancient Egyptian, it's really more about her afterlife than her life.
Yes, that's right. Shall we have the first picture? Well,
so I want to start by asking you some of the facts of her life as she lived it.
Sure. Well, we know very few of her facts. What we know about Cleopatra is she was, as you say, the last queen of independent Egypt before it was annexed to the Roman Empire. Have we got the first picture? No, never mind. She had two lovers in her lifetime. The first was the great Julius Caesar. The second was the almost as great Mark Antony, two great Roman military heroes. Together with Mark Antony, she challenged Octavius, the man who was to go on to become the great emperor Augustus. Augustus or his forces defeated Antony and Cleopatra at the Battle of Actium, and after that defeat, Cleopatra committed suicide, perhaps by the bite of a snake, commonly known as an asp. That's a very imprecise zoological term. And in fact, in paintings of Cleopatra's death, she's usually shown sort of nearly naked with a very pretty little snake sort of curled around her bare breast. This makes a rather delicious image. In fact, the snake that killed her was probably a 6-foot-long cobra. This is one of the many, many instances where Cleopatra's legend deviates from the probable facts about her.
Well, one of the things that's perhaps a legend or perhaps true is about her physical appearance. I mean, according to some stories, she was a stunning beauty, absolutely irresistible seductress. But according to some archaeological evidence, that's not true. What's the real Cleopatra?
That's right. She became the heroine of a famous love story. This was, in her afterlife, in her legendary life. And so, of course, it was assumed that she must have been a great beauty. And so much, and this legend had taken over from the sort of facts about her almost within her lifetime, and certainly very soon thereafter. So there's one account by a late Roman historian about the occasion when, after Cleopatra's defeat, after Mark Antony had died, Octavius came to see Cleopatra, and he was so frightened of looking at her, that he stood with his back to her throughout their interview because he thought, according to this account, that if he were to so much as catch a single glimpse of this devastatingly alluring beauty, he would be immediately smitten with love for her, and he would, as Mark Antony had done before him, cease to be a proper Roman or a proper man, and he would be dragged off to the fleshpots of Egypt and sink into incurable decadence and cease to be worthy of power in Rome. Now, so, that's the story about Cleopatra, that, to see her was to love her. In fact, the only reliable portraits of her are those on coins made in her lifetime, and they show her with an enormous hooked nose and a hooked chin that kind of almost meets it. Really not pretty by the standards either of our own time or of hers. And one of the best accounts of her life is written by the Greek historian Plutarch, writing nearly 200 years after her lifetime. And Plutarch had read descriptions of Cleopatra by people who actually knew her. And he says she wasn't particularly good looking. She was attractive, she had a very charming voice, she was very intelligent, she had a good manner, but nothing special in the looks department. But of course, and this does help when you're trying to attract people, she was the richest woman in the world and the most powerful.
Much more important stuff, yeah. No, apparently one of the reasons why she has this long chin and big nose is because she had to look like a Ptolemy. She had to look like someone from her family. It was unusual to have a queen. So she was supposed to look like her father so that her people could recognize her as one of the correct line, yeah.
Yes, that's exactly right. And the reason why her coins show her looking very, very masculine, not at all sweet and pretty, would have been that she wanted to project an image not of the seductress, but of the great potentate, the person of power. But it wasn't unusual for an Egyptian queen to be a proper queen rather than a queen consort. Cleopatra reigned in partnership with two of her little brothers in turn, to whom she was married, and these incestuous brother-sister marriages between the king and queen of Egypt were conventional. It's unlikely that either of Cleopatra's marriages to her brothers were consummated. They both died when they were very young. One of them fighting against her, he died on the battlefield, and one of them almost certainly murdered by her. And after her second brother died, she ruled in partnership with her baby son, whom she always claimed was Julius Caesar's son, and he probably was, although Caesar never acknowledged him. But of course, he was a generation younger than her. He wouldn't challenge her, so that she ruled effectively alone for the rest of her life.
And why did she turn into such a legend? I mean, if you look at the number of authors, painters, musicians, operas, I mean, really, there's virtually no great classical writer of any kind who didn't deal with Cleopatra as a subject. Why did she become such a legend?
Well, it's a good question, because, of course, there were many other distinguished queens of Egypt. But the main answer is that Cleopatra became very significant in the history of the West, in the history of the Roman Empire. And most of our sources for her story are either Roman historians or poets, or Greeks or other people writing under Roman domination. And so Cleopatra was interesting because she got tangled up in the history of Rome. So that's the practical answer to the question. But there's also the fact that her story has three themes which make it endlessly resonant. It's a story about love. It's anyway imagined to be a love story. And Cleopatra's relationships with Julius Caesar and Mark Antony, they were partnerships, and they were possibly love relationships. We'll never really know. It's a story also about power, and in particular about female power. And people have been finding the idea of a woman with great power disturbing. from that day to this. So that continues to be something that either people admire and want to emulate, or something that they find disgraceful and threatening. And finally, it's a story about race. An enormous number of the versions of Cleopatra's story that I've studied and I'll be talking about today were produced in the West, in Europe. And so in those versions of the story, Cleopatra is defined as the foreigner. And the foreigner is at once suspect, a little bit frightening, but also exotic, alluring, exciting.
And the object of desire and also the victim of conquest, somehow. There's quite a whole pathology there, really, isn't there? Could you tell us some of the particular stories that are associated with Cleopatra, that some of which got most illustrated or used by later writers?
Yes, there are a lot of stories about Cleopatra, which may or may not be true. There's one which is very, very popular with painters because it allows them to paint a sort of gorgeously opulent scene, which is the story of Cleopatra's pearl. So the story goes that Cleopatra had met Antony, seduced him, persuaded him to quit his duty as a Roman military leader and come back with her to her capital of Alexandria, and there to give himself up to a life of luxury and self-indulgence. And they would have a great feast every night. And so night after night, these feasts became more and more splendid. And there came a night when Antony kind of came down at dinner time and said, but, not stuffed peacock again, this is getting tedious, haven't you got something special for me tonight? And Cleopatra said, yes, actually I have. Tonight we're going to have the most extravagant, luxurious dinner anyone has ever eaten. And she was wearing a pair of enormous pearl earrings. She took one earring out of her ear, dropped it in a cup of wine, drank it, and then took the other pearl out of her other ear, dropped it in another cup of wine, and handed it to Antony. And he said, no, really, I can't do this. This is such a waste. Now, that story it's a stock story. It's a story which symbolizes extravagance and overindulgence and general irresponsibility. It was told about the Emperor Nero. It's told in Latin sources about 3 other people. It's a story that can just be, latched on to any character it seems to fit. And it is one of the few we can say this is really isn't true, because pearls don't dissolve in wine or in vinegar, as some versions of the story say vinegar. And any acid that was capable of dissolving a pearl would do something really awful to the stomach of a person who drank it. So we know that's untrue, but there are many others. I mean, there are, they say that Cleopatra took a bath in ass's milk every night. Well, maybe she did, but the first source for that little detail is actually the 17th century. So, it's not a very authoritative story.
And they're still selling soap made from ass's milk in France at a very high price. So someone may have been quite interested in getting that story out. And it's also possible with the pearls dissolved in wine story that she used fake pearls.
Do you know, I haven't thought of that.
Yeah, there you go. So that's another, which is, to say that Cleopatra is one of the greatest victims in history of fake news to a certain extent. I mean, there's so much mythologizing about her, which actually, it begins with her own self-created myth. I mean, there were so many layers of myth around Cleopatra, but there's her own myth generated by, as propaganda as Queen of Egypt, and then taken over by the myths of others. I mean, and she is also a victim of the truism that history is always written by the victor. I mean, she famously lost. She lost to Augustus Caesar and lost her throne. I mean, what would you say about the sort of creation of fake news after Cleopatra? I mean, how did that generate itself?
Well, there's a kind of perverse vanity, I think, by which we like to persuade ourselves that we in this generation are responsible not only for all the kind of good, progressive things that come with modernity, but also for all the bad things. And there is a very sort of widely spread notion that news manipulation, propaganda, political spin doctoring are, products of the past few years. Not a bit of it. It's been going on for thousands of years. And Cleopatra, the legend that we have of her story is different from the historical facts, not because over a long period the facts get forgotten and distorted, but because in her lifetime, as Max says, her enemies were putting out propaganda against her. But she was also a very able spin doctor herself. I mean, one thing she did, after the Battle of Actium, which was a catastrophic defeat for Cleopatra, she and Antony retreated to Alexandria. Actium was on the coast of Greece. They had quite a long sail to get back to their capital. It seemed very important to Cleopatra to keep the bad news from her own people for as long as possible, because she wanted to keep her allies on side. So as her ships sailed into the port at Alexandria, she gave orders for the garlands of flowers to be hung around the sides of the ships as though she was celebrating a great victory. She was really good at propagating fake news. And that was something she'd been doing all her life. And her first meeting with Antony, the famous scene of her sailing up the river in her golden barge and being met by Antony, who immediately fell in love with her because she was such a dazzling sight. And the description of that episode in Plutarch was reproduced by Shakespeare almost exactly word for word. I mean, if Plutarch and Shakespeare were both alive now, Plutarch would definitely be winning a case for plagiarism against Shakespeare. And you can see through Shakespeare's description, and also more clearly through Plutarch's original description, that what Cleopatra was actually doing was not just laying on a seductive show for Antony. She was presenting herself as the goddess Isis, which she was. As Queen of Egypt, she was the earthly incarnation of Isis, the sort of mother goddess of the Egyptian pantheon. And as the goddess Isis, she was an immensely powerful and attractive figure, the mother of her people, the ruler of the East. And in dressing as Isis, which Cleopatra did for all ceremonial occasions, she identified herself with the goddess, which created an image which would have been immensely potent for all of the contemporaries who saw it. I think we don't have pictures, do we? Otherwise, I have some lovely images of gorgeous film stars in those clothes, but never mind. And I mean, Cleopatra dressed as Isis would often be depicted by later painters with sort of more or less topless. It became conventional in Western painting to show her with very few clothes on. But the truth is that actually, in her lifetime, she would have been very dressed up. And the last great tableau that Cleopatra staged as part of her propaganda exercise was her own death. When she died, committed suicide by the bite of a snake, she was identifying herself very closely with the goddess Isis. And in an enormous number of Renaissance paintings, we see Cleopatra topless with this pretty little snake. But in fact, she would have put on all her royal robes, as she does actually in Shakespeare's play. He got that bit right. She would have dressed for death, not undressed. But we'll come later to the idea that Cleopatra has become the kind of the kind of upmarket pornography for an awful lot of painters over the hundreds of years between our lifetime and hers.
Well, and just to before we go on to speak more about the sort of fantasy Cleopatra that's created, there's still a bit about the political Cleopatra and how she became the victim of fake news I want to touch on, which is that, I mean, basically she was on the losing side of a Roman civil war. I mean, there was Mark Antony on one side and Augustus Caesar on the other, and she was on the losing side. And as the defeated part of this, she was, in a sense, used to change the image of her victor as well. I mean, he'd been a victor over all the bad things she represented. I mean, the Romans threw every sort of insult at her in many ways, didn't they?
Absolutely. She was accused of wearing herself out with sex with her household slaves. And Cleopatra was a great queen, and she came of a dynasty which habitually committed incest rather than take partners who were in any way socially inferior to them. She wasn't going to be wearing herself out with the household slaves. And that kind of slander was part of an exercise designed by Octavius, the future Augustus, and the many writers who were under his patronage, to discredit not actually Cleopatra, she didn't matter very much, but her partner Mark Antony. Antony and Octavius were the great rivals for power in Rome after the assassination of Julius Caesar. And so Octavius and his tame writers were out to discredit Antony. That was their main aim. And those tame writers were pretty distinguished. I mean, among the great Roman authors who were working fairly directly for Octavius were Horace, were Propertius, were Virgil, some of the greatest poets of the ancient world. And they put across a very persuasive case. And the story they told was that Mark Antony, who had been a great military hero, a very masculine figure who was always swaggering about, wearing a leopard skin, who was adored by his soldiers, who had been the victor in many campaigns, who was the very representative of Roman masculinity, had been somehow unmanned by Cleopatra in falling in love with a woman who had independent power. He had done something which to Romans seemed absolutely weird. I mean, Egypt was much more, rights for women were much better in Egypt than they were in Rome. Egyptian women could own property. They were far more independent, whereas Roman women really just didn't exist legally. They couldn't sign contracts. They couldn't own anything. They were their dependent first of their father and then after marriage of their husbands. So Cleopatra and all other Egyptian women seemed to Romans to be in the kind of, modern parlance. They were ball breakers. They were, women who had far too much power. They were therefore acting like men, which meant that any man who got involved with them would become that pathetic, weak thing, a woman. And so there are a lot of passages in the Roman historians' accounts which suggest that Antony was dressing as a woman in Alexandria, that he'd allowed Cleopatra to take away his sword while he just sort of lounged about strumming on a guitar. And he had ceased to be a real man, he'd ceased to be a real Roman, and therefore he no longer had any right to challenge Octavius for supreme power in Rome.
And it's an irony, and I know you've pointed this out often, that Western view of the East has been, in a sense, flipped around in the modern era, where the East often looks at the West as this land of dangerous voluptuaries and so on, which is, it's just an interesting irony. Who is the real Cleopatra? It remains a terrible, enormous mystery. And I just wanted to mention that my daughter, who's in the audience, was asked recently in school to write an essay about the woman, the historical woman she would most want to spend an hour with. And the obvious answer was Cleopatra, because she is such an enigma. I mean, you really have to sit with Cleopatra to find out what she was all about. And of course, the vision of Cleopatra gets more and more distorted as one goes through time. I mean, can you tell us how the sort of fantasy Cleopatra evolved over time after her death in the Roman era?
Absolutely. Well, now, really, Cleopatra, the legend, Cleopatra that your daughter wants to meet, was created sort of inadvertently as a kind of side effect of Roman propaganda. Because, as I say, the Romans were setting out to say that Mark Antony had been so destroyed, made so decadent by his passion for Cleopatra that he had given up his right to rule Rome, in other words, to rule from a Roman point of view, the whole world. So this wasn't intentional, but oh, we've got the pictures, hooray! Okay, this is the lovely Vivian Leigh in one of the Cleopatra films. Maybe we'll flick through some of the early pictures because they are gorgeous. Yeah.
Can we move forward with the pictures a bit?
Yes, can we just have a sequence of pictures? So next one. Yes, so this is the bust of Cleopatra, sorry, the coin of Cleopatra that I was talking about early, which shows, is the only absolutely trustworthy contemporary image, not really a great beauty. And next picture, please. This is a marble bust which is currently in a museum in Berlin, and it shows. We can't say for certain it was Cleopatra. A lot of scholars think it is. And so it shows what she probably would have looked like. She was of Greek descent, and she would have dressed as any sort of high-born Hellenistic woman of the period would have done, and looked something like this. Let's have the next one. Now, this is one of a gorgeous painting by the Venetian 18th century painter Tiepolo, and this shows the story of the pearl. And here is Cleopatra, in a setting, lots of gold plate around her, a gorgeous palace, and she's dropping her pearl into her cup of vinegar. Next picture. This is an interesting part of Cleopatra's own propaganda. This is a relief from a temple in Egypt. It was made in Cleopatra's lifetime and on her orders. She's the figure on the left, and she's wearing the kind of outfit that she looks like a woman from the pharaonic period. Now, Cleopatra wouldn't habitually have dressed like this or looked like this. This is as anachronistic as it would be for, say, the present-day Queen of England, to go about her daily business dressed as Queen Elizabeth I. But Cleopatra, by having herself depicted in this very anachronistic style, was trying to assert the fact that her dynasty, which was actually a foreign Greek dynasty, which had only taken over Egypt a couple of centuries earlier, was as legitimate as the ancient pharaohs had been. And that full-size adult figure in front of her is supposed to be her baby, Caesarion, who was probably the son of Julius Caesar. And at the time that he was, this portrait was made of him, looking very grown up, he was actually rather less than 1 year old. Next picture.
And she has a double chin, I think, in that picture. She's a little double chin.
And now this is actually one of my favorite Cleopatras. This is the gorgeous Claudette Colbert, who starred in the fabulous Cecil B. DeMille film made in the 1930s. And then we'll get Vivian Leigh. Next picture, please. Here she is again. Most of the world's most beautiful actresses have played Cleopatra in their time. Next picture. You're getting a feast of pictures now, aren't you? And now this is, I was talking about Cleopatra being the occasion for sort of high-class porn. This is a painting by the Victorian painter William Etty. And when it was displayed at the Royal Academy, the novelist William Thackeray said it would take a whole forest's worth of fig leaves to make that painting decent. And indeed, you've got a lot of naked ladies there. And so it goes on. Next picture. Yes, I mean, this is a Roman fresco, so already this is supposed to be the death of Cleopatra. And as I've said, actually she put on all her clothes for her death, but painters love to paint her more or less unclothed. Next, another naked woman. Next, yeah. Yes, and another one looking very inert, poor old Cleopatra there. That's a painting by the neoclassical painter Regnault.
Lucy, can you talk a bit about how this evolved over time? I mean, because we're going through all of these images, but there is a sort of change over time of how she was portrayed.
Absolutely. Now, you will have noticed, possibly, that in the painting by Tiepolo, an 18th century painting, Cleopatra is shown as being blonde because she was, according to the legend, she was seen as the heroine of a love story and a great beauty. And it seemed obvious to the poets and painters of Northern Europe that in order to be beautiful, you had to be blonde. So the medieval poets describe Cleopatra as having hair like spun gold, eyes as blue as the sky, and breasts as white as ivory billiard balls. Now, of course, Cleopatra, we know that on her father's side, she was of Greek descent, mostly. We don't know who her mother was, but she probably looked, as most Mediterranean people do, would have been comparatively dark-skinned and dark-haired. But an awful lot of the Northern European painters showed her as being very fair. And actually, we might... Yeah.
So her appearance changes over time, and I mean it changes more and more. But also the sort of the story and the moral of the story, so to speak, the kind of moral of the myth of Cleopatra changes over time as well. How does that evolve?
Well, Cleopatra. The thing about the Roman propaganda on Cleopatra was that Antony had fallen for her so completely that he gave up everything. John Dryden entitled his play about Cleopatra, "The World Well Lost." It's as though Cleopatra was the gratification of every desire. She was the woman worth giving up absolutely everything for. And so in the course of presenting her that way, the Romans said, as it were, she is the one woman who is completely irresistible. And so, obviously, that creates a kind of blank screen onto which all kinds of different desires, all kinds of different ideas about women can be projected. Can we have the next picture? And the next one, we'll go fast forward. Next. That's a lovely painting by Gustave Moreau showing her looking so alluring, so unlike what she probably really looked like. Next one. Right, now this is Cleopatra as she was seen in medieval Europe. And here she is, well, she seems to have two asps this time, standing next to Antony, who's killing himself with his sword. And the interesting thing, well, there are a lot of rather surprising things about this painting. I don't suppose the original Cleopatra ever wore a wimple. But here she is. But this particular depiction is firmly in the tradition of the depiction of the Christian martyrs, who were always represented in the act of killing themselves or being killed, because the most noble thing about them was the fact that they'd accepted their own death. Now, Cleopatra died as any defeated commander of her time would have. if you were defeated, you killed yourself. That was just the Roman thing. But in the Middle Ages, she came to be seen as having killed herself for love. And it seemed to medieval authors that this was a jolly good thing to do, that women shouldn't survive their men. So if your man dies or leaves you, the only decent thing for a woman to do was to kill herself immediately. And, and so Geoffrey Chaucer made Cleopatra the foremost heroine. This is in, what's the date, 1380. Chaucer wrote a rather gloomy, long poem called The Legend of Good Women, which is all about women killing themselves when their men left them or died. And Cleopatra is absolutely number one. Now, this is just so untrue. I mean, Cleopatra survived Antony by several months, not just by a few hours, as Shakespeare represents it. And during all that time, she was scheming and negotiating with Octavius and trying to find a way to hang on to power. No way was she giving up just because her man was dead. But it didn't suit the medieval thinkers to imagine that she was that independent. So, so for Chaucer, Cleopatra was a good woman, absolutely, a good woman, number one. But in the course of subsequent centuries, she lost her claim to virtue and perhaps became a little bit more interesting. So let's have the next picture. This is the lovely, mischievous Claudette Colbert again. And Claudette Colbert was the star of Cecil B. DeMille's fabulously extravagant film of 1934. And Cecil B. DeMille, when he got in touch with Claudette Colbert, what he said to her was, "How would you like to play the wickedest woman in history?" And that's how Cleopatra was by then being seen. And of course the answer was, "Yes, please, I'd like to play that part very much." Because by the 20th century, to be wicked was to be sexy and fun and exciting.
So how did Cleopatra turn from a good woman in the 14th century to a wicked woman in the 20th century? What terrible thing happened to her in between?
Well, her story actually went through many variations. Let's have the next picture. Next picture. No need to pause. Oh yes, there's Claudette again, isn't she lovely? And the next one. Oh yes, and there's another version of Tiepolo. Next one. I've got too many pictures. Ah, yes, now this is the moment when Cleopatra suddenly loses her blondness. This is a painting by Delacroix, and it's the first one I know of where she's shown with dark hair, dark eyes, looking not quite European. And at this point, this is a shift which reflects a shift in the meaning of her story.
And sorry, Lucy, and when is this picture from?
This is from the 1790s.
1790s.
Yeah, so quite late. But I mean, I found in writing about Cleopatra that I was writing about a whole load of different subjects which I'd never expected to write about. I mean, for instance, I find myself writing about the ethics of suicide. I mean, in the Middle Ages, there was this, as I say, she was seen as a martyr. She was seen as someone who proved her virtue by killing herself. But that was a bit of a problem because suicide was actually a Christian sin. And so that became a big subject of debate. And then Cleopatra, in Shakespeare's time, it's a story about passion. And then later, particularly in the 17th century and the 18th century, it becomes a story about politics. Can we have the next picture? Now here we have Cleopatra, she seems to have gone blonde again, on her knees before Octavius. And in this period, all the plays about Cleopatra stress the political themes. There's a conflict between the centralized monarchy represented by Octavius and the kind of wayward aristocracy represented by Antony. or there's a conflict between monarchy, as represented by Cleopatra in Egypt, and the Roman Republic. You can play it any which way, but it's always political. And this, by the way, this is pure fantasy, this scene of Cleopatra bowing down before Octavius. This is the scene she killed herself rather than take part in. She would not ever publicly humiliate herself like this. So it's a political story, and then in the 19th century, it becomes a story about Orientalism and about imperialism. Let's have the next picture. So this painting by the Orientalist painter, French painter Gérôme, shows Cleopatra parading herself before Caesar, dressed like a kind of Turkish dancing girl. Cleopatra would never have looked like this.
Well, wasn't she supposed to have had herself sneaked into his palace, rolled up in a carpet, and then unfurled from the carpet? And I think that's what's happening.
That's
here.
right.
Is that right?
And actually, that is one of the very colourful stories about Cleopatra, which actually I think I can believe. Anyway, I want to. And painters certainly want to. It makes a wonderful tableau. When Cleopatra was 17 or 18, we don't know her exact date of birth, probably 18, she was involved in a civil war with her younger brother, or rather his regent. And Julius Caesar arrived in Egypt, established his headquarters in the royal palace. Cleopatra at that point had fled from Alexandria, but she had herself smuggled back into the city. She knew if she could get Caesar on her side, he'd arrived in Egypt with an army, she could drive her brother and his party out of the palace and she could seize power. And so the story goes, and actually this one, there's no real reason to disbelieve it, that she had herself carried into the palace, wrapped up in a carpet, and carried all the way into Caesar's apartments, the pretext being that this was a carpet that was being presented to him as a gift by some Egyptian aristocrat. She was carried into his room, and the carpet was unrolled, and out sprang the lovely 18-year-old Cleopatra. And Caesar, who was a notorious womanizer, took one look and thought, yes, please. And they did have a love affair, and they had an affair, whether they loved each other or whether they were just a kind of, seizing the moment, I don't really know, but they did produce a son.
And being the richest woman in the world had nothing to do with it.
Well, at that point, actually, when she got with Antony, she was the richest woman in the world and a very powerful ruler. But at this point, she was, as I said, she was queen. She should have been powerful and rich, but she'd been dispossessed. She'd been driven away from her capital. And Caesar put her back on the throne, and with his backing, she was able to, her brother was killed in battle, and she was able to really seize the power that rightfully belonged to her. But it's interesting that Caesar wrote his own autobiography, as anyone who's ever learnt Latin will know, because you're always given Caesar to read first, because he had a nice, clear prose style. But he never mentions any emotional feelings for Cleopatra. All he says is, I went to Egypt, or actually he says he went to Egypt. He always refers to himself in the third person, because that sounds more important. So Caesar says Caesar went to Egypt, and he restored Cleopatra to the throne along with her second brother. That's all he has to say about her. Because at that point in her life, she was just, yet another of his mistresses. And there were several queens among Caesar's mistresses. She was nothing special. But 20 years later, by the end of her life, she had already become a legend.
And if we go back to this picture, this is painted in the early 19th century. What happened during and this is just at the beginning of the sort of Orientalist wave. What happens to Cleopatra as we get closer to the present?
Well, certainly during the 19th century, during the period of the expansion of the European empires, Cleopatra comes to represent the Orient, the East, and also Africa, because Egypt being, as it were, on the corner where Asia and Africa meet, could be taken to personify either continent. And Cleopatra is very often seen as being, for one thing, she's very often sprawled on a chaise longue. Let's have the next picture. This is the gorgeous actress Sarah Bernhardt, who played Cleopatra over and over again throughout her lifetime. And like many Cleopatras, she's nearly always lying down at this period. And there's this idea of the East, the Orient, as the people at that time referred to Egypt, as being somehow passive, languid, pretty hopeless.
Corrupt, I think.
Corrupt, definitely corrupt. And badly in need of a strong Western chap who would come along and, inject a bit of energy and, all these people who are just lying around on chaise longue all the time, take over their countries, run them because the natives didn't know how to do it for themselves. And so in paintings of Cleopatra, I think one sees an awful lot of the mindset which spawned that imperialist way of thinking.
And what's happened to Cleopatra now in the 20th century? I mean, there's a play on in London right now. Or do you have some more pictures you want to show of the?
Yes, let's look at another picture. Next one. Right, this is Cleopatra as femme fatale. I mean, the other thing that happened in the 19th century to Cleopatra is that she became a killer. Now, in real life, Cleopatra did kill quite a few people, including some of her siblings. She wasn't a very nice person. I mean, I think that there's a tendency nowadays to say, oh, Cleopatra's been maligned for sort of sexist reasons, but actually she was a jolly good, responsible monarch, and we ought to respect her. She wasn't, she wasn't without her faults. But there is a fantasy which springs up in the 19th century. It originates with the Russian poet Pushkin in the 1830s. Pushkin wrote a poem called Egyptian Nights, in which he imagines Cleopatra announcing at one of her many banquets, a banquet where Antony was not present, that she would offer the privilege of a night in her bed to any man who was willing to accept on condition that he would be executed at dawn. And there were a surprising number of volunteers for this privilege. And then sort of 19th century poets and painters loved this story of the idea of a woman who was so appealing that, you give your life for just a few hours in her bed. And of course, there's an enormous amount of misogyny in this idea of the femme fatale, the woman who, it's death to come near her. But there's also, I think, a feeling that this fantasy of the femme fatale, it's not all about hating women. It's maybe also something to do with 19th century men's anxiety about their own desires and their kind of suppressed guilt, their wish to at once express their sexuality and simultaneously be punished for it. Let's have another picture. Oh yes, here's another femme fatale, Cleopatra. This is Cleopatra reclining again, and the figures in the background are carrying away a dead slave whom she's just poisoned for her own pleasure.
Lucy, I think we have 10 minutes left. Would you like to open up for a few questions now, or would you like to show more pictures? Or,
I think we should give the audience a chance to chip in, don't you?
And you can also read the book, which is a good way to find out how Cleopatra is brought up to date. But yeah, some questions. I'm sure there's some questions. Yeah, so over there. Can we get a mic to this gentleman over there? Yeah.
And perhaps while we're getting the mic, could we just put the rest of the pictures on, just so people can look at them?
Good afternoon. Thank you very much for this lovely presentation. I want to know, what do we know about the fate of Caesarion? How he died and what happened to him?
He was killed. Octavius couldn't possibly leave the son of Julius Caesar alive, because Octavius's main claim to the succession, to be the most powerful man in Rome, the emperor, as he was soon to call himself, was that he was Julius Caesar's heir. Now, in fact, he was Julius Caesar's heir in the sense that he inherited his private wealth. But, Rome was not a hereditary monarchy, never had been. So Octavius was only rather tenuously related to Julius Caesar, who was his great nephew. But it would have been very, very threatening for him had there been somebody going around, a young man, as Caesarion was by then, who could actually claim to be the son of the great Caesar.
Question right at the back there, fellow in the yellow shirt. Is that too far for a mic to reach? Back
hello.
there?
Excuse me, hello. Excuse me. So I have the mic here. Yeah.
It's okay. Well, he's got the mic now. Yeah. Go ahead.
Thank you very much. So I watched a movie on Cleopatra, and they have shown that the Cleopatra was killed with the poison of a snake. She had, it was a suicide by herself. How true is this story? What was the cause of death?
The cause of death? Well, there are various different theories. Plutarch, who is quite a reliable source, says that she died either by the bite of a snake, which is usually referred to as an asp, or maybe by using poison which had been somehow put into a comb, and so she stuck this comb into her scalp and poisoned herself that way. She might conceivably have been murdered on Octavius's orders. The story that Octavius put around was that he wanted her to stay alive so that he could take her back to Rome and display her, but chained, and march her through the streets of Rome as a kind of trophy of war. He knew that she wouldn't want to do that. So he was probably just trying to persuade her to kill herself, really. But she was rather slow to do so. She thought she could somehow hang on and maybe get her power back. And it's possible that he got impatient and just had poison put in her food. We'll never know for certain. But the story of the snake is convincing because the cobra was Isis's familiar figure. So again, by dying by snake bite, she was sort of reaffirming her identification with the goddess whose representative on earth she was. So it was a fitting way for her to die. And not an uncommon one. In Egypt at the time, a very common way of executing those who'd been condemned to death was to put them in a pit full of snakes.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So
yes, right in the back.
Ma'am, my question is that I have always read your work and you always...
Sorry, we can't quite hear you here.
My question is that you have always, to ma'am, that you have always briefed your work over writing pages. And Cleopatra being the wicked and the loved women, the epitome of strength and valor, and thus fake even, there are instances where she's been proved to not have a ring on her finger. She's even called barely a woman. She's even said to say that she prefers fresh virgin boys over prince. Does that prove that she was a classic teenager woman who would prefer Julius Caesar's son over Mark Antony? And is it all her karma which brought her back of being so wicked?
Did you? I'm sorry, I don't think we missed the beginning of that.
But what was the question?
I'm not quite sure. What's the question?
I think the only thing I heard was she a typical teenager? And
yeah, was she a typical teenager woman who was just doing all these instances because she had the power, beauty, valor, strength? And was it because, what were the reasons that she was such a wicked and loved both?
Well, Cleopatra's teen years were certainly not very typical of mine or of anyone else's. She was the heir to the throne. When she was very young, her father, who was the ruler, went off to Rome for a long sojourn. He was away, and while he was out of Egypt, Cleopatra's elder sister usurped the power. Ptolemy, Cleopatra's father, came back, had the older sister put to death. He reclaimed his throne, and then the next sister also tried to usurp their father, and that sister was also executed. So Cleopatra had seen two of her elder sisters put to death by their father as a result of them having rebelled against this father. This was a pretty dysfunctional growing up. After those two sisters and the father were all dead, Cleopatra, in her late teens, became queen jointly with her younger brother. Her younger brother's regent pushed Cleopatra out of the capital, so she found herself, as it were, in exile from her own kingdom, while she was still at an age when, most young women nowadays are still at school. It was not the kind of teenage experience that you come out of normal, I guess.
I think we have time for another question. Yes, madam, in the front here.
Cleopatra is portrayed as using sex to gain and retain power. Can you hear me? How much of that do you think would really play out well? It's an interpretation, I understand. How would that interpretation play out given this Me Too time that we have? How would you reinterpret that if you were to rewrite it now?
I'm sorry, I missed the first part of the question.
Cleopatra is a classic case of using sex to gain and retain power.
Oh, yes, I see. Well, yes, according to the legend, she is. And certainly her first meeting with Julius Caesar was very... I'm hesitating because I don't want to use the word cynical, but calculating. She wanted an alliance with Caesar. If it involved sex, fine. She wanted Caesar on her side, and it worked. Her partnership with Antony was more complicated. By the time that she and Mark Antony got together, she was secure on her throne. She'd been ruling successfully for 8 or 9 years. She was a very efficient administrator, and we know that simply because her father was deeply in debt. The reason he kept going off to Rome was he needed to borrow money. He just couldn't run his kingdom. Cleopatra and the people around her managed to re-establish the Egyptian economy to a sort of dazzling effect, so that the economy flourished like mad. She was, a hard-working, busy queen working on administration. She's remembered as this love story and sort of sex goddess. Actually, at this point, she was married, either married to a very young brother or ruling together with her baby son. She lived celibate. She didn't have a sexual partner. And when she met Antony, she was pleased to meet him. She went to meet him on her golden march, wearing all her gorgeous robes. But what she was looking for was a political partnership. She had the money. Antony had the men. He was a military leader. He had an army. Together, it seems, the traces of this are fairly ambiguous in the Roman sources, but it appears that Antony and Cleopatra together aspired to establish a kind of empire of the East, which would rival the empire based on Rome. So, and it happened, they had 6, and they had twin babies, and a third son later.
And we have to go, I'm afraid. Yes. Thank you so much, Lucy. That was absolutely fascinating. I mean, what could be more interesting than a biography, but also a biography of one of the longest afterlives in the world? I mean, that's a 2,000-year-long afterlife she's had. Thank you so much. That was absolutely fascinating. Thank you.
Thanks a lot for giving us an insight to the life of Cleopatra. And Lucy would be moving to the book signing.